So this evening's program looks at a challenging but important question. How might Southeast Asian states respond in the event of a conflict between the United States and China? With a number of active global conflicts and as strategic competition intensifies across the Indo-Pacific, understanding the perspectives, priorities and constraints of regional players has become increasingly important for military strategists, policymakers and businesses. Southeast Asia itself is often discussed collectively, but each country brings its own mix of domestic political considerations, economic relationships, security partnerships and foreign policy traditions to questions of regional security that we'll be looking at tonight. So tonight's program draws on the recent report that is available to everyone tonight, Maritime Southeast Asia Amidst an Armed Conflict between the US and China. The report explores the various dynamic factors that shape decision-making during a major regional crisis. So the report breaks down the strategic calculations that influence decision-making across Southeast Asian governments, including political dynamics, economic and security dependencies, and potential leverage points. And it also draws on a simulation workshop that tested the relevant dynamics in practice, highlighting how different variables shape alternative outcomes. So please feel free to grab a copy later on when we have our networking session after the program. So for tonight's program, you'll be hearing from the authors of the report, followed by an expanded discussion and opportunity for Q&A on what these scenarios mean for Australia and Southeast Asia amid heightened geopolitical tensions. So without any further ado, let me introduce this evening's speakers. So beside me to my left is Natalie Sambhi, a Senior Policy Fellow with us here at Asia Society Australia. Natalie is founder and Executive Director of Verve Research, an independent think tank focused on Southeast Asian foreign policy and security affairs. She's a lecturer at the Australian War College and a non-resident fellow with the Brookings Institute's Foreign Policy Program. Natalie has a PhD from the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre at the Australian National University on the Indonesian military's collective memory of its experiences in East Timor. Please put your hands together for Natalie. And joining us virtually from Singapore is the other report author from tonight is Dr. Bich Tran, who is a research fellow at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies and a non-resident senior fellow at Verve Research. Previously, Bich was a postdoctoral fellow at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy and an adjunct fellow at the Centre for Strategic and International Studies. Her research spans grand strategy, maritime security, cybersecurity, outer space security, and emerging issues at the intersection of geopolitics and technology. Please put your hands together for Bich.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, James.
And finally, the discussant for today's report is Dr. Premesha Saha, a Senior Policy Fellow at Asia Society Australia. Premesha's research focuses on emerging trends in Indo-Pacific geopolitics and regional security architecture. Her expertise includes minilateral cooperative frameworks, great power competition, and policy in the Indo-Pacific. Her work also explores India-Australia relations, India's Act East policy, and India's broader engagement with Southeast Asia, East Asia, and Oceania, as well as maritime security in Southeast Asia and the Indian Ocean. Please put your hands together for Premesha. Okay, great. So as mentioned, we'll have a discussion with the authors this evening, but please have a think about some questions you'd like to ask, because we'd like to maximise as much Q&A time with you all tonight. But Natalie, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks so much, James. I first want to acknowledge my Asia Society Australia colleagues for putting together this evening's event. And second of all, I'd like to also acknowledge the Australian Department of Defence. Through their Strategic Policy Grants program, Bich and I have been able to undertake this research for the past 2 years. So really with that kind of research assistance, we've been able to put together policy relevant research that goes directly to practitioners and back to the Australian public as well. So as Southeast Asia analysts, I'm sure Bich and even Premesha would agree, we are often bombarded with a series of questions. And perhaps one of the most annoying questions that we get often is, how will they choose? Will they choose the US or will they choose China? Now, there are obviously a couple of challenges inherent in that question, and as James has already pointed out, is the tendency to lump Southeast Asia as a homogenous bloc. And the idea of if there's any kind of major security challenge in the Indo-Pacific, that is necessarily a binary choice for these 11 states. Now, what Bich and I wanted to do with this report was to centre Southeast Asian agency as our study. That is, to flip the script to look through the perspective of Southeast Asian policymakers and people to understand what kind of considerations are really going on in these capitals and in the rest of their country when faced with major security challenges. Now, obviously, there are a range of different social, economic, and security challenges around us, but we wanted to focus on US-China conflict in particular, not because it's something that is the most likely, but it is something that is potentially the most disruptive and most dangerous in our region. And so we know that there are a number of studies that have looked at how Southeast Asia might respond under conditions of peace. Bich and I really wanted to push that out and look at, well, how might Southeast Asia respond under conditions of conflict? Now, of course, 11 states is a large remit to tackle. So Bich and I narrowed down our scope to 5 countries in the region. That is Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, Singapore, and Vietnam. We picked those 5 countries because when you look from an Australian perspective, of course, noting this was an Australian-based study, we looked directly to our north, and our Defence Strategic Review and Defence Strategic Updates, amongst other important strategic documents, identifies Australia's northern approaches, particularly Indonesia and Papua New Guinea, as Australia's military area of interest. And so from that perspective, not only is Southeast Asia a critical area of security concern, but it is also one of the fastest growing regions economically. And so there is a lot of prospect and connection there for Australia and our people. And so looking to our immediate north is of a concern. And around this immediate north area is the Malacca Straits and several other critical maritime trade routes. And that's surrounded by Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore. When we thought about the most likely conflicts to break out in the Indo-Pacific area between the US and China, we identified that would likely be in the West Philippines or South China Sea, or would probably involve a contingency regarding Taiwan as well. So that being the case, then immediately we would have to look at the Philippines and Vietnam. So in totality, these 5 states became the focus of our study. Bich will explain a little bit more in terms of the methodology. But again, as James outlined, the idea was to look at all the different factors that these decision makers would be thinking about, whether they just be economic or social, geostrategic or others, but more than just will they pick China or will they pick the US. So before I go into some of the major findings, I'm going to hand over to Bich to discuss a little bit about the methodology.
Hi, thanks everyone for being here, and thanks Natalie. Actually, because there's hard copies in the room, I welcomed you to go through the methodology sections. So what I propose here is that maybe I will talk a little bit about the patterns that emerged from the study, and then maybe I can talk about how. And after that, I will hand back to Natalie to talk about how these kind of patterns look into the case of Indonesia and Malaysia. And then I can continue talk about these factors in the case of Philippines, Singapore, and Vietnam. How does that sound?
Yep, let's do that.
Okay. So from the report, we can see that there are several patterns that emerge among the factors that are likely to shape the responses of the 5 Maritime Southeast Asian countries. And but we notice that even within the pattern, there's differences. For example, the first pattern is that both the United States and China rank among top trading partners of all 5 countries. But the share of total imports, exports actually vary, and this gives different levels of leverage. From the poise of major power over the 5 countries under studies. And the second pattern is that all 5 of them have citizens who reside in Taiwan and maintain some form of one China policy, which might not be exactly the same and also different from China's one China principle. And then the third pattern is that this country, their decision-making process is highly centralized. But we realize that we have, different political system, and that leads to different key decision making. So back to you, Natalie.
Thanks so much, Bich. So yes, just pulling apart some of those major findings, as Bich talked about just now, the US and China are obviously the major trading partners, but often there's assumption that, for instance, that China can apply economic coercion and that will force Southeast Asian countries to fall in line. We know now that the United States is also capable of applying economic coercion. And so while we did most of our interviews before the major tariffs were applied towards the beginning of last year. These are factors that we've identified that are applicable not just to the United States and China, but other major powers. So if you take our study not just of an identification of factors in a point in time, but as a blueprint of how to look at Southeast Asia, how to understand the kind of factors, where to look. So while we might have studied 5 countries, we believe the kind of approach that we've adopted can be extrapolated to look at the rest of the 6, or if not any other country when looking at those considerations in the Indo-Pacific as well. So let me go down into the case of Indonesia, of course, the largest state in Southeast Asia, 250 million people, 17,000 islands. It's a significant country if you think of any kind of armed conflict to occur, not least of all because of its location relative to the maritime trade routes, but the likelihood that American military assets and Australian assets will be moving north from Australia through those waters as well. So Indonesia has a very significant geostrategic place with any kind of potential US-China conflict. So when it comes to a consideration of an Indonesian government, it's not going to be proximate to perhaps the shooting wall, but it will certainly be significant, and that is one of the primary considerations. The idea that the straits will be vulnerable, the idea that the Indonesian military is still in a phase of modernization where it's still trying to be able to control its waters. These are significant questions. But as Bich pointed out, because we looked at the case of Taiwan, citizens, the number of citizens who are working and living in the Taiwan Islands is a significant consideration. Now, how much? For all the 5 states that we examined, the case for Indonesia is the most acute. According to the latest statistics of the Ministry of Manpower in Taiwan, Indonesia has approximately 350,000 people living in the islands. Now, if you consider undocumented people, that comes up to about 500,000. Now, in other times of crisis, the Indonesian government has tried rapidly to move its citizens out in places like South Sudan or even in the Middle East. But now we're talking about a small cluster of islands where there are no friendly airports. We have significant logistics problems, which is likely to become a very acute humanitarian emergency as well for non-combatant evacuations. And you look at that from the flip side as well. I was recently in Taipei, and Taiwanese interlocutors told me that the level of care work that's provided in that country is provided largely by Southeast Asians, if not exclusively by Southeast Asians. And 3 out of every 4 care workers in Taiwan is Indonesian. And so that there are other considerations from the other side about how this might play out for an Indonesian government, but also for Taiwan itself. So that is unique in the Indonesian case. If we look at Malaysia, not as large as Indonesia in terms of population, but again, proximate to the Malacca Strait. So by virtue of its geostrategic location, significant in terms of the movement of trade or its negotiations with Indonesia and Singapore about the closure of those maritime routes as well. It also has a significant number of citizens in Taiwan, so that will also be a consideration for the Malaysian government, the extent to which it will be able to work together with Indonesia or other partners, let's say Japan or perhaps the United States, Australia, to help move its people out. But the calculation for Malaysia itself is also very different. One of the things that the Malaysia case brought up to us is the importance of subnational actors. Often when we look at and we study these states, we often look at government actors, we look at the national government, what's happening in the capital. But particularly in the case of Malaysia, we understood that the eastern provinces, Sabah and Sarawak, who had their own resource relationships and investment relationships with China, the way in which China can apply or can disrupt federal level strategic policy thinking through building up these relationships with Sabah and Sarawak is an important factor as well. And that was reflected in the case of the Philippines, where subnational actors, mayors and governors could also have an interesting relationship in this sort of strategic space. Last but not least, in the case of Malaysia, before I hand over to Bich, is the factor of it being another multi-ethnic state within Southeast Asia with significant Chinese-speaking population as well. Around 23% of Malaysians identify with having Chinese heritage. Now, again, this is not necessarily a cause for alarm, but it's something that the Malaysian government will have to factor in, the sense of vulnerability of Chinese language-speaking communities to propaganda or other kinds of disinformation operations by certain actors. And we know that disinformation operations are conducted by a range of different actors within the international system. We know Russia has done that in the past, other actors as well, state and non-state. But specifically in the context of our report, when we think from the perspective of the Malaysian government, the extent to which it needs to improve the media literacy of its people, and therefore the kinds of roles that countries like Australia can play in these kinds of national resilience activities is a critical consideration as well. So handing back to you, Bich, to cover off the rest of the three.
Yeah, thanks, Natalie. So in the three remaining case studies, when we talk about the level of trade dependence on major power, if we look at, for example, even though the common theme is that both China and the United States are top trading partner of these countries, but when we look into the detail, the share of total imports and export, then we can see a different picture. Just to give an example, Singapore's import from China account only for about 12.45% of its total imports in 2025. But this figure go a lot higher in the case of Vietnam, 40.9%. And for a country, who is export-oriented like Vietnam, and it's actually for the imports, it uses a lot of intermediate and capital goods from China for its own manufacturing. So if any disruption on this will cause serious damage to Vietnam's economy. And then looking into the case of export to the United States, I focus on exports because I'm thinking about the tariff by the US government. So for the details, for example, Singapore's total export to the US market only account for 9.8%. But for the case of Vietnam, is a lot higher, more than 32%. So this means that China and the US, they do not have substantial trade leverage against Singapore or even in the case of Philippines, but a lot in the case of Vietnam. And if we look at into the domestic factors, the political system, in each country they have different key decision makers. So in the case of the Philippines, it is the president who is the most important in foreign policy making, serving as both head of state and government as well as the commander-in-chief. And the level of power concentration even reinforced because the president in the Philippines is limited by a single 6-year term, which may limit accountabilities because the president doesn't worry about re-election. So because of this, foreign policy can vastly differ from one administration to another. In the case of Singapore and Vietnam, foreign policy are more stable. But even that, they have different system. For Singapore, it's kind of a very close consultation between different ministries and agencies before the prime minister make the decision. But in Vietnam, it's a collective leadership among the party leaders, which mostly, the highest body is the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Vietnam, but they don't meet very often, only a few times a year. So the day-to-day decision-making is put to the Politburo, a smaller group within the Central Committees. So we can see that for each case, there are various factors that, in the time of conflict, we need to concern at that time who's in power and what their priorities are. Because if we look at the case of the Philippines, for example, each administration has their own priorities. Some may put economic development above all, but others may see that sovereignty is the utmost important.
Thanks very much, Bich. So again, just to emphasize, our report is very much looking at these kinds of factors, providing a blueprint of where to look in each of those states. Bich talked a lot about the domestic political factors. We looked into that, but again, with different emphases in each of our 5 different case studies as well. And Southeast Asia is a very rich site for study, not least because of its ethnic, religious, and social heterogeneity, but also the heterogeneity of its political systems. You have democracies, you have monarchies, you have single-party states, amongst others. But again, I just want to highlight this centralization of decision-making capacity within the executive despite the political differences, was something that we found quite common. And perhaps we can unpack that a little bit more in the Q&A.
Great. Okay. Premesha, I might ask you to make a comment. You've been in the Southeast Asia space for quite a while. What were some of your reactions to reading the report?
Thanks, James. Firstly, congratulations, Natalie and Bich, on this very important work. And we've done a lot of back and forth, etc. when guys were even working on the report, and they've done tremendous work on it. I encourage everyone to just give it a read. It's also available online if you don't like reading hard copies. But, the one thing which Natalie said, and which most of us as Southeast Asia, I won't say experts, but analysts have always pointed out, and I have pointed this back even when I used to be in India, that you can't look at this region as a one-size-fits-all approach. It's not possible. You have to look at each country individually, not just during conflict scenarios, but even when you're trying to design a Southeast Asia policy as well. You can't have one policy which addresses all the 11 countries. And I think that's something that they have done very well in the report, bringing out the individualities and also the differences that each country have, not only in their political systems, in their strategic cultures, and how they think of when they are designing their own policies, or even working, or how they react to certain conflict scenarios. And I think very few things, if you don't have to delve deep to even understand this, for instance, and I'm sure Natalie will go into details about the 3 conflict scenarios that they have looked into. One being the South China Sea dispute, for instance, that they have looked into. A case if there is a dispute between Philippines and China, the spillover effect, not on, in the whole region, and how that would impact globally as well. And whenever we talk about maritime disputes, and I think the very first thing which comes in your mind in a dispute scenario is banking on maritime law, international law. But everybody talks about freedom of navigation, all of that, innocent passage, transit passage. But also when you look a little deep, you'll understand each country has its own way of interpreting those laws as well. So that's just a very small example of showing that the reason why you need to study each of these countries separately in conflict scenarios, and also during the peacetime as well, just to understand how each of them would respond to certain conflicts or certain issues which are emerging in the region as well. And that probably would be not my question, but also, ask both Natalie and Bich if during their fieldwork, if during the exercises, they face that when it even comes to international law, banking on international law within Southeast Asian countries, where there are differences of opinion in how they would want to use international law to deal with these kind of disputes as well. The second thing is also, I think, when they're talking about economic dependencies, there is we, for example, had a couple of fellows coming to visiting us last week as a part of the ASEAN Visiting Fellows program, which Lowy is doing. And they mentioned about, and this is something like where they mentioned about domestic scenarios, where how leaders kind of deal with foreign policy. And in Indonesia, for instance, we have a president right now who doesn't listen much to his ministry officials or, to his own advisors, and tries to do things on his own mind. And a very key thing which she pointed out was that, they listen much more to external actors, for instance. And if, for instance, an external actor like China and Australia go and say that, we are unhappy with a certain thing, that would be more useful in moving the president in doing something about it, rather than his foreign ministry people going and feeding that information to him. So these are informations, I think, and these reports probably provide that blueprint as to where countries like Australia, dialogue partners, can play a role here in the region as well. Besides that, I think the other key issue here, another thing which is worth looking, and this is a question which most of us, I think Natalie, we were in an ASEAN Secretariat workshop in 2023 in January, and we both asked that question sometimes. What do you expect the dialogue partners to do? We are all dialogue partners of the ASEAN, but what is our role? What do you expect out of us? And I think these kind of reports, it not only provides a blueprint, it also gives you some sort of a base to understand what kind of a role you can play in the region out of just the economic, the basic economic and investment functions that you have. This is a region which is looking at diversification a lot of, and I think Bich can answer that more. And we got to know that they're looking at new frontiers besides traditional partners when they're talking about investment. So there are a lot of actors now coming in the region as well. We have Middle East, we have Latin America, Russia, Europe, besides, players like US, Australia coming in the region. And there is a lot of overlap of initiatives as well. So there is this need for external powers to also talk to each other and see where you can play to each other's strength and actually do something worthwhile in the region as well. And it can be even during these kind of conflict scenarios, because I think they have mapped out a certain instance where you have a lot of Southeast Asian nationals in Taiwan, for example. There will be the question of evacuation. And if that evacuation is to happen via China, again, there can be a instance where China might provide some causes or some kind of scenarios in front of you. Can external powers then come and do something about it to help Southeast Asia come up with an alternative route plan, or even in these kind of scenarios? So I think I spoke more from an external powers perspective, but because Natalie and Bich have already given that regional perspective, and that is what this report does, bring out the regional perspective and sort of provides a lesson to external powers as to how you should not only follow the region, understand the region, and also sort of design your own policies and thinking around it. And I'll stop there, and because I know that we are indulging more in the Q&A, so I'll just stop there.
Great, thanks, Premesha. Natalie, what I've found so fascinating about the report is going through these three particular conflict simulations that you ran. So conflict 1 from Philippines, China conflict to US-China conflict, scenario 2, US-China conflict over Taiwan, and scenario 3, direct US-China conflict. Would you be able to provide the attendees in the room with a bit of context of how you ran these simulations, and if at anything, what surprised you about any kind of particular tidbits about, the responses from the participants?
As I mentioned earlier, Bich and I had started this study by interviewing people and doing desktop research. So Bich and I actually traveled to the capitals of the 5 countries that we studied. But then we wanted to test out how these factors that we identified would actually play out under certain conflict conditions. The idea was not to create a predictive model, but the idea to narrow down certain variables and to test Southeast Asian countries, say, for instance, with the Taiwan evacuation consideration, or where you actually have the United States umming and ahhing about whether it would come to the Philippines assistance. How would Southeast Asian states react? So the idea was that we got representatives from each of the 5 countries we studied to come to Singapore, and then we had 3 other teams representing the United States and China, and where they all played in this scenario, this simulation. So they were given this scenario just before the activity. Each of the teams were given a briefing sheet about the major points about trade dependencies or the military levels of capability or the number of citizens they had in Taiwan, amongst other things. And then they were allowed in a couple of hours, hour and a half, to discuss within teams or between teams and negotiate what their response would be, and more importantly, why. What would the factors be, the primary ones in the first round of this scenario activity, and to get them sort of warmed up. So what we found is that actually of the 3 different scenarios, there was a comfort level of a lot of these Southeast Asian states wanting to work together. The major regional body for Southeast Asia, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, which was set up in the 1960s, primarily to prevent conflict between Southeast Asian nations and to give them a sense of bargaining power amongst the 2 poles of the Soviet Union and the United States, was something that's still very much functioning, but mainly as a forum for Southeast Asian states to come together and to talk, to try and find some sort of collective understanding, not necessarily a collective response, but a collective understanding at the very least. And in some issues, perhaps Taiwan evacuations or looking at food and fuel resilience, amongst other things, there would be a sense of collective response when going out to an external party to ask for support. So that was an interesting thing for us, even towards the end when I actually said, all right, we need to push these scenarios even harder. By the time we got to the 3rd scenario, I said, just assume that ASEAN isn't functioning anymore. So imagine a world where the United Nations is defunct. So that's the example I gave for ASEAN. And To our surprise, perhaps to our not great surprise, we had all 5 countries come together and form a new association, not called ASEAN, but called OSEAN. So again, it tells us that there is this comfort level between these states to coalesce together. You know, when you've got smaller states relative to major powers, there is safety in numbers. But certainly the issues that were on the table necessitated there to be this clear kind of communication. And these kinds of fora, even though critical we are of them to say that they're toothless tigers or they don't solve any of the problems like Myanmar, Thailand, Cambodia, they still have an important function.
I also found it interesting that, unsurprisingly, a lot of the countries had, you know, a lot of inertia around, you know, choosing a side, right? It's very, very difficult. As Bich outlined, as the report outlines, there's a lot of engagement with both China and the US on the trade front and the security front. But what was interesting was that a lot of the countries seemed to put their hand up as a potential mediator to play a role. Bich, I might ask you, is there any particular country that has the best profile as a mediator in Southeast Asia, should there be a conflict between the US and China?
I think that in one of the scenarios, China actually explicitly named Vietnam as a potential candidate. And I think for Vietnam, because of the way that they conduct foreign affairs and foreign policy, very flexible and try to be friends with all. So they do have some advantage in playing this role.
Okay. Premesha, with Natalie just touched on ASEAN, the fact that, you know, scenario 3, they created this new body. How important is the chair of ASEAN in a potential conflict, and what type of agency does the chair of ASEAN have should there be, you know, a conflict like this?
That's a very good question, and this is something just worth pondering upon, because this is a rotational chairmanship as well. But I think, as we've seen, for instance, in the case of the Myanmar crisis, where they have employed an ASEAN envoy because they are aware that, you know, chairs would rotate every year, and some of these conflicts have been persisting. So having an ASEAN envoy or a representative in the area, and this is something I think many Southeast Asian scholars have also pointed out, that besides the chair, there has to be some kind of an ASEAN envoy or representative which is not as rotational. And all the 10, now 11 members should have an envoy, one representative from each of the country, who would be doing this coordination, closed-door meetings with all the ASEAN member countries, so that the responsibility doesn't alone fall on the chair. So this has been suggested by quite a few Southeast Asian scholars themselves, because sometimes I think people also miss the fact that ASEAN, and this is also another thing I'm sure Bich and Natalie might have come through during their research as well, that many are of the opinion when people say that ASEAN is not functioning well, is also that misinterpretation that ASEAN should be also having some kind of a role in solving these kind of a global dispute. But ASEAN was never created for solving global dispute. It was always to do more of intra-regional cooperation. So I think the answer would be having more of an, so I think the Secretariat was in a way intended for something like that, where you'll have one ASEAN envoy from each member country coming together to discuss these kind of scenarios as well. But yes, in the Myanmar thing, the envoys have also not done well. Obviously, they have not been able to implement the 5 decision points that they that initially Indonesia helped come up with after the coup happened. But again, it's also difficult to bank completely on the ASEAN chair, because right now the question is not about the ASEAN way. There's a lot of question about the ASEAN unity. So there is a lot of these regional differences between countries themselves. So if you are going hard on Myanmar, then why not go hard on Thailand on a certain issues as well? So I think these kind of scenarios also come in, and that makes it difficult for the chair. So probably having unbiased envoys from each of the member states would be worthwhile. And this has already been, this is not my own suggestion, and I don't want to plagiarize somebody's suggestion, but this has been suggested by Southeast Asian analysts, mostly by CSIS, Jakarta, when they were writing about a peace plan for the Myanmar crisis.
One final question from me, and then we'll go to the floor. Natalie, this report's taken 2 years, and during that time, the Trump administration had its, Liberation Day tariffs. What effect did this have on the report? Were you able to see how this impacted Southeast Asian responses in real time, given that historically, we talk about China as the country of economic coercion, but, the current US administration is privy to it itself. And just to expand on that, when an actor is wearing the US hat, do you need to drill down to it being a democratic US or a Republican US, given the divergence of foreign policy that the US is now undertaking?
Look, I think there are particular nuances of the current Trump administration that give certain policymakers, particularly in Manila, pause for thought about whether or not their formal ally is going to come to their assistance. But I think there is one answer to both of your questions, and that's to any student of history in the room would understand that Southeast Asian states look at major powers, all of them, with a level of equal suspicion and apprehension. And the experience of Southeast Asian countries, in particular Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, even Indonesia with CIA operations throughout the 1960s, students of history will know that smaller powers are wary about who their great and powerful friends are. So Southeast Asian states are, by and large, despite their formal allies, largely not aligned for good reason. Not only have they emerged from the experiences of colonization, subjugation, in some cases occupation by the Japanese, emerging into a world where they were forced and be pushed and pulled around by the Soviet Union and the United States. The current international environment is no different. Southeast Asian states are looking for strategic space to realize their own national interests, and that doesn't necessarily mean being bullied or subjugated by any major power, including the United States as well. So the current behavior of the Trump administration just turns up the volume on that kind of suspicion, and it drives with even greater intensity this idea of strategic hedging by Southeast Asian states, and we can see that in the ways in which they've built up their relationships with the European Union, with Japan, with Canada, with India, amongst others, and even Russia. So this kind of behavior might look strange from our perspective, us having been a formal treaty ally of the United States. There's safety, there's security, there's predictability in that. But for smaller states in the region that have had these historical, political, and social experiences, strategic hedging is the norm. And so the United States is but one of multiple partners in different ways. Still an important security partner, but by no less seen with any less suspicion than others.
Thank you. Bich, is there anything you'd like to add to that at all?
Yes, so I would like to give an example of to see, I think in the past, we often associate economic coercion to China. But, for the case of Vietnam, because of the high volume of export to the US and then the tariff threat, then suddenly, it's not just about one major power, but two or even more. So I think, and I have to be honest that even though there has been recognition in Vietnam that the country should not rely on any single partner or market, but way back in 2014 when China sent an oil rig into Vietnam EEZ, but the implementation has been very challenging. Vietnam has joined many free trade agreements, trying to reduce dependence on back then China and now the US. But after more than a decade, it has been changed much on the ground. And I think it's come back to the road of small and medium enterprises because they tend to, because they're small, so they prefer to go with affordable materials for their own manufacturing. And it's very difficult to replace China. And I often turn to India as, the country with a kind of equivalent size to China, the size of population and potential. But we know that it's also not easy to turn India into another China in terms of manufacturing power.
Great. Thank you, Bich. Okay, are there any questions from the floor at all? If you just want to raise your hand. Yep. Andrew, so if you could just briefly introduce yourself as well.
So Andrew Quinn, RMIT University. Thanks for that. That was actually really, really interesting. I have to say I haven't read the report yet. I will be tomorrow. I'm glad to hear that you're really centering Southeast Asian agency in this process. Well, another binary when it comes to conflict is people assuming that it's obvious when conflict starts. And I just thought I might ask the question around whether in your research you found differences of view in Southeast Asia around when and if they would ever have to pick a side / make a conflict-driven decision. And there's a whole bunch of stuff behind that, whether it be sort of hybrid forms of pressure or increasingly even forms of pick our AI, pick our whatever it is, or financial systems, trying to separate those. But also separately, some forms of pressure would disproportionately hit one country and not others. So, it might actually be existential to one country in Southeast Asia at the same time it's not to, say, Australia or other countries in Southeast Asia. So just thought I'd ask that question around when we talk about conflict, was there a shared picture of what that actually is amongst Southeast Asian capitals?
I have to answer it, but I want to give my co-author, Bich, perhaps the opportunity to answer it first.
So we remember during our study tour in the capitals of the 5 countries under study, and when we asked the question of what would they do in a scenario of an armed conflict between 2 major powers, and the first reaction is that they always want to talk about conflict prevention. So they're very, very proud of what they have done to prevent conflicts from happening. And we have to push really, really hard for them to accept the assumption that we start with, that conflict already happened, and then what do we do now?
Thanks, Bich. There are other instances where, in the certain scenarios, it mattered to our Southeast Asian respondents who started it. It's a confusion about who is responsible. So in the Taiwan scenario, where Taiwan unilaterally changed its constitution, there was less sympathy amongst certain Southeast Asian states, not the Philippines. Of course, because the Philippines has a proximity issue with Taiwan, it has a sense of affinity about the democratic ideals of remaining resistant to this kind of domination. So again, these kinds of differences were very important. We can't account for every variation of that, but these were the sorts of things that gave us this kind of hints. The idea of cyber attacks and other kinds of shooting war kind of issues were also part of this mix. And some of our colleagues said to us, well, trade war, does that count as well? So again, it depended who we spoke to.
And thanks so much for your talk today. You kind of touched on my question with the comment around concerns about who started it, because it seemed, so I'm wondering how you account for those perceptions around how actions by the major powers are interpreted as being in accordance with international law or otherwise justified. As an example, the recent US attacks on Iran were not seen to be entirely justified, and so many regions, the Gulf allies, European partners, didn't allow their territories to be part of the invasion, prevented all fly rights, and etc. And contrast that with, say, the first Gulf War, where the actions of the Saddam Hussein government were so egregious that all of those nations came together to repel them. And so how do you account for that in these scenarios?
Look, I think certain states, particularly the Philippines, are banking on international law. That is one of the things that they're holding on to, given the 2016 arbitral decision that was handed down in favor of the Philippines 10 years ago next month, I might add. But other states have seen the damage and the detrimental behavior of the United States, amongst others, in flagrantly ignoring international law. So there is a sense of skepticism about the extent to which international law can provide any kind of restraint or any kind of answer under conditions of conflict. So that's one thing. And so there's questions there, I think, for states in Southeast Asia about the extent to which UNCLOS will be upheld or international law will provide that kind of restraint. There was a recent case where the Indonesian defense minister went to Washington to meet his American counterpart. And around that time, there were rumors in the media that the Americans had asked for a blanket overflight in Indonesian airspace. Now, I'm not sure why the Americans asked for that, because they were caught 14 or 15 times in Indonesian airspace, violating Indonesian airspace without answer to the Indonesians, which tells me even if there's an abiding by international law or rules and agreements, the United States will do what the United States wants to do when the moment comes. And I think Southeast Asian states know that. And it's a question of how they will respond when the time comes, whether there's a sense of common interpretation of what the problem is. Irrespective of who started it, the vulnerability will be the same.
Okay. Yep.
Hi. Sorry, I haven't had time to read the report fully myself either, so you might have answered it in there. But I know you talked about the reliance on imports versus exports, and there's a bit of air and sea freight that's been touched on. Did you look at kind of the degree of reliance on air and sea freight and potentially different ports in terms of how that might play out for the different countries there? Because I could see that one that was quite highly reliant on sea freight, for example, in terms of goods, might feel that a bit more acutely and then just have that whole situation play out for different scenarios there a little bit differently.
The short answer is we looked at trade overall, and some countries like Singapore that rely on large amounts of maritime goods moving in their waters were considered. But because we're talking about 5 maritime countries, inevitably the movement of maritime goods, freight and all that is critical. And that came up especially so in the last scenario when we looked at the restrictions of food and fuel supplies. Now, we held the simulation exercise in October 2025. Before Iran, before any kind of restriction in the Strait of Hormuz. That experience of the scenario coupled with what was going on in real time actually brought home to us, especially sitting in Australia and watching our fuel prices go up and creeping concern about the availability of things like plastics and fertilizers. That was very acute and very real for Southeast Asian countries, particularly for those countries that are not net food providers. Like Australia, we're a food basket country. But if you're a country in Southeast Asia that is reliant on certain kinds of imports, then that starts to become very concerning. That is because in countries in Southeast Asia that are still concerned about social cohesion, where variations in inflation make a significant difference for a very large percentage of the population that is hovering around the poverty line or in circumstances of precarious economic security, social cohesion leads very quickly, coupled with economic difficulties, to political instability. And so that may not necessarily be a scenario that we think about in Australia, but for Southeast Asian states, that is certainly something in the forefront of their minds. Go ahead, Bich.
Yeah, and maybe I can add a little bit about Singapore. So Singapore imports most of its food overseas. So for now, I don't have the exact figure, but I know that they have an initiative called 30 by 30, meaning that they are trying to produce 30% of their food domestically by 2030. So it's safe to say that at this time, the percentage of their own production is under 30%. So it's a really big concern for Singapore.
Any other questions at all?
I do want to add something if our audience isn't. Please.
Thanks for your speeches. It's very interesting to listen to you. My question, because we're talking about the major power conflict, and the Asian states, especially Southeast Asian states, are not just emerging powers, which we know for many years, but also middle powers. And so my question is, what did it make them to go to see Putin in Kazan in Russia? I mean, the European Union states are also now trying to get more connected with him again, because they hope that can then help to close this war, which goes on for 4 years and 4 months already. But the European states, especially the ones in the East, are much closer, and are also worried that Putin could attack them, especially now if you look at Hungary, which doesn't have the same leader anymore who supported Putin all the time. Right? But Putin is a war criminal, and Australia doesn't support him. Australia doesn't want to stay very connected with him. And of course, Trump, who said even before his election, Putin is a genius and he can do whatever he wants to do with the tax on Europe. That's what he said. So my question is really, what do Asian states do to meet with him?
So coming back to the idea of looking at each individual Southeast Asian state, there are a number of states that have historical ties with the Soviet Union and Russia these days. There are other Southeast Asian states, particularly Malaysia and Indonesia, that see Russian arms as an important source of its military modernization as well. There are some that look to Russia and Ukraine as a source of wheat, amongst others, so there's a food security element of it. And for ASEAN as a grouping, which recently has, there's been a meeting, I think, if I'm not mistaken, between ASEAN and Russia, again, the idea of a plurality of different actors and different supporters. Now, there's an excellent book out there by a colleague of ours, Ian Story, at ISEAS, the think tank in Singapore, who chronicles the history of Southeast Asia and Russia, and that has fluctuated a lot. We can't say that Russia has had the same consistent history as the United States, as China, as India, or even Japan in this region, but it is still an important player, and it is also because it allows that sense of non-alignment. It gives a sense of meaning to that, that Southeast Asian states are exercising that in reaching out to different actors. Now, is it frustrating from the perspective of democratic states to see Southeast Asian states engaging with that? But the reality of the international system is such that realpolitik still prevails. Indonesia still has an embassy in North Korea, amongst other places. And so, as uncomfortable as it may be for certain states in the European Union to see Southeast Asian states engaging in this way, it's very much driven from a state of necessity and a state of strategic culture as well.
Hi, Grant Wyeth. Sorry, I haven't read the report yet, but did you outline or did you game out what happens with the outcomes of conflict, to say if China does successfully annex Taiwan, or if it does successfully take full control of the South China Sea, does it game out what Southeast Asian countries will do there?
No, we didn't game it out. What we did in the time that we had is we looked at 3 different scenarios at the end of 2026, which when we ran it last year seemed much further away in the future, 28 and 2030. We wanted to give participants a chance to look in the nearish kind of future of what those conflict scenarios might be and those immediate factors. We acknowledged that over time, the ordering of factors would change, but we didn't play this out longitudinally. We did it by different scenarios. And that's certainly something that we would look at in a follow-up study as well. But for the purpose of ours, it was to see under different circumstances what kind of things arose first and foremost. The last thing I want to do is to give the so what to this audience. Now, as I said earlier, this report was largely written for practitioners. It was sponsored by the Department of Defence, but is also made available to the Australian public. And we know in Melbourne, this is not the same as a Canberra ecosystem. We're here largely from civil society, from universities, from the private sector as well. So let me offer 3 so whats for you tonight. And thank you very much also for making time to come down here. The first and foremost is as a reminder to think about Southeast Asia in more detail with regard to history, with regard to a more nuanced understanding as well. That's something I think we can do better as a community, whether that is through our education systems or even raising the level of detail in the kinds of conversations that we have about these kinds of issues as well. The second point that we didn't just delve into as deeply into our report, but we certainly would in future, is looking at the role of non-state actors. So particularly in this case in Melbourne, what is the role of investment by private actors, by banks, amongst others? What is the role of telecommunications companies in providing alternative communications infrastructure for countries like the Philippines, where they're largely reliant on Chinese-based infrastructure? And what is the role of civil society organizations in providing solidarity and so support to workers overseas, amongst others, those that might be in a Taiwan contingency as well? And last but not least, it is to keep yourselves educated about these kinds of issues, to monitor the international environment with a lot more strategic empathy for the Southeast Asian states, and where possible, participate in public inquiries where government policy is concerned. That is a very healthy thing to do in a democracy, and as we as citizens participate in that, and therefore engaging ourselves and thinking with that strategic empathy with Southeast Asian states would make our policy more effective and richer as well.
Okay, well, thank you, Natalie, and congratulations, Natalie and Bich, on the report, and thank you also, Premesha, for joining us. Can you all please put your hands together for our speaker this evening?